Hello there. Today I'm lucky enough to be flying in Emirates business class on an A380 from Dubai to London Gatwick. So that gives me the opportunity to try some of the wines that they've got available. In my glass at the moment I have the 2022 vintage of Concha y Toro's Don Melchor. Now Don Melchor is a premium label for Concha y Toro, and Concha y Toro are one of Chile and South America's largest wine producers. The brand is named after Don Melchor Concha y Toro, who founded the company that now bears his name back in the 1880s. It was Don Melchor who imported vines from Bordeaux to be planted in the Maipo region in the 1880s. At that period, phylloxera hadn't hit Bordeaux, and of course phylloxera has never actually reached Chile. The Don Melchor vineyard was first planted in 1890 and was planted with ungrafted pre-phylloxera vines. The vineyard is located on the north bank of the Maipo River in the foothills of the Andes Mountains at somewhere in the region of 650 metres above sea level. So you have the cooling influence of the proximity of the river and also the altitude to moderate the temperature here. The Don Melchor vineyard is quite a large vineyard with about 127 hectares of vines planted. Now these vines aren't the original plantings, there's an average vine age here of about 35 years. They're still ungrafted vines and they're planted with what's called a massal selection from the original vines that were planted. So the viticulturists have gone in and picked the best examples of each variety and they've used wood from those particular vines to propagate from as they replaced vines here. The plantings here are about 90% Cabernet Sauvignon with 7% of Cabernet Franc, 2% of Merlot and 1% of Petit Verdot. And the 2022 is the 36th vintage of Don Melchor that's been made. And Don Melchor is quite a significant wine for the Chilean wine industry, given that it was the first Chilean wine to appear in Wine Spectator magazine's annual selection of their top 100 wines. Now the vintage conditions in 2022 were relatively cool. As a result of that, the ripening was slow. The notes I have said the style is quite elegant. The fruit was handpicked with great care. It was put into 10 kilogram crates to make sure that there weren't multiple layers and therefore the fruit didn't get crushed and release juice, and thus it reduced the amount of oxidation that would go on prior to the fruit reaching the winery. At the winery there were two levels of selection. They've selected first by bunch and then by individual berry. Fermentation went on in stainless steel tanks. The temperatures were regulated to between 23 and 25 degrees centigrade, so relatively cool to prevent temperatures being too extractive. Depending on the lot, fermentation lasted between 8 and 10 days, and to regulate extraction there was a pump over done 3 times a day. So at the beginning of the fermentation, for the first 4 days or so, they'd pump over the entire volume of the tank in 3 stages through the day. Going on from that towards the end of fermentation, they reduced this back to give themselves a little more control over the extraction. So initially only pumping over half the tank in a day and then reducing that to just a third. Once fermentation was complete, the tanks were hermetically sealed and the fruit was left to macerate in there, still at a reasonably warm temperature, around 23-24 degrees centigrade, with the idea being that that resulted in the extraction of smoother tannins. The final blend of this wine is 95% Cabernet Sauvignon. There's 3% of Cabernet Franc goes in there, and 1% each of Merlot and Petit Verdot. Now the wine aged for 15 months in French oak barrels. It's not specified, but I would assume those would be 225 litre barriques. And of those, 68% of those barrels were new oak, and the balance had only been used for one vintage prior to this. Now the notes I've seen suggest that the drinking window for this wine should be between 2028 and 2045. So this may still be a little bit young, but let's have a look at it and see what we make. First thing I'd say is looking at the colour. It's deep, it's dark, there's a red-purple note to the rim, but I certainly can't see through it, it's opaque. And as I look at it, it really does hold that colour density well to the rim. Swelling it as best as I can in this quite tiny glass. Let's see what we make of the aromas. Mostly there's a red fruit note. What's to the fore is something like cranberry, relatively ripe red cherry, full of richer ripe red cherry, but then that's being counterpointed by earthy notes and slight touches of cedar. There's a good intensity to the aromas. So let's give it a taste, shall we? Gosh, that's rich and mouth-filling. I should have said earlier, it's labelled as being 15% alcohol, and you can see still some quite prominent tears on the glass here. What I'm getting is a rich, bursting red to black fruit. So there are notes of dark cherries, there are notes of dark plums, all underpinned by cedar and spices. There are notes of nutmeg, cinnamon, perhaps even a tiny touch of ginger. There's a grainy tannin right across the mid-palate that were the fruit not so rich and full, and there's quite a sort of a rounded, juicy, glycerol nature to this fruit. If it wasn't for that, those tannins would be quite drying and quite astringent. But actually they're reasonably well in balance, and some quite fresh acidity, ensuring more sort of ripe black fruit on the finish. This is where I'm seeing notes of cassis, but I guess there's more of a sort of an opulent black cherry note. Although I've mentioned the wine's 15% alcohol, and it is making the finish quite big and quite warm, it doesn't stand out because there's such a density of fruit here that the two are in balance. I'm in two minds as to whether I think this is a wine to drink now or whether it should stay in the cellar for a couple of years. I think with the right food, a piece of beef, some juicy lamb, this might work really well. But certainly it has the power and has the structure to leave in the cellar for another 5 years and then age for a further 10 years or more after that. It's a wine that's impressive for its opulence, its power, its richness, and the combination of grip and a lovely smooth texture. I noticed that the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this is 96, and that's a very impressive score. And I think that reflects the wine's opulence and richness. I think it's also very impressive to find a wine like this available to drink in business class on a flight. I think it shows that Emirates work really hard to get high quality and relatively mature wines onto their flights. I have to say I've always been quite impressed by the wines I've tried on their flights, and this one certainly hasn't let them down. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have, it would be fantastic if you could press the like button. If you would like to watch more of these tastings, do please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and that way you get yourself an alert and make sure that you're notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon based wines, about the wines you've tasted on Emirates or other airlines, or anything else that relates to this wine or other wines I've tasted. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the page for this vintage of this wine on the Wine Searcher website, and that way you can go and you can check if the wine's available in your market and at what price. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope perhaps you'll manage to make some time and come and join me and watch another video wine tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.